the theme of camp was King of Kings. Okay, King of Kings was the theme of camp. And Monday night, we kicked off camp and we looked at Jesus through the lens of the book of Revelation. All right, so what we didn't look at is we didn't look at Jesus in the Gospels, the humble lamb who came to serve and give his life, but we looked at the Lion, the King of Kings, the almighty Jesus. And then we proceeded to examine 5 different earthly kings that came before him throughout the rest of the week. I started us off, and I looked at Saul, which is what we're going to kind of look at today. And then we looked at David the next night. We looked at King Josiah, who was an 8-year-old king who led the nation of Israel, which is insane. And then we looked at King Jehoshaphat, and we looked at finally finished with King Solomon. And I believe that, to me at least, something that was the most important that we were learned about, this discovery, was that didn't really matter whether each king was good or bad, because we looked at some bad kings, we looked at some good kings. But they all failed in comparison to the King of Kings, to Jesus. And I think that's something very, very important. This last year during youth group, this last semester, we looked at types and we looked at prophecies of Jesus. And what we kind of took away from looking through all the different types of Jesus in the Old Testament was that, yes, these types pointed us to Christ. They were they came before him and they gave us hope about the future coming Messiah. But what we really came away with was that these types failed in comparison to Jesus. That there's a lot of things in our life that can kind of be a type of Jesus or try to take the place of Jesus in our lives, but ultimately, these things fail. Your life must be ruled by King Jesus. And if we look at the book of Judges, we're not going to, but if we look at the book of Judges, Israel was originally ruled by 12 different judges, right? You can go back and you've heard of a lot of them, Gideon, Samson, right? You've heard of them before and you've read their stories. And some of them, again, were good. Some of them were better. And that was just that. And the role of the judge was often to point the people back towards God, right? So Israel would stray, they would start worshiping idols, false idols, they would be captured, they'd be put in captivity, and then there would often be some sort of military campaign led by a judge to free them, followed by a spiritual one, and then they would get back in that same habit and go over and over again. But somewhere along the line, there was a rejection of God as judge over the nation. See, Eli and Samuel were then kind of overseeing the nation as prophets. But something unfortunate happened. Both of them had very wicked sons. Very, very wicked sons. And so, if we go now to 1 Samuel 8, it says, "Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his first one was Joel, and the name of the second was Abijah. And they were judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, 'Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations.' But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, 'Heed your voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served God, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice, however you shall solemnly forewarn them, and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them.'" So Samuel, he gives the people a warning. He tells them, hey, if you take a judge or a king to rule over you, what's he going to do? He's going to take your children to serve in the army or to serve him. He's going to take your land to serve him and to grow crops for him and grow his stature. And he's going to take the money that you make to grow himself. So Samuel tells them this, and they don't really care. They say it again. We want a king. And specifically, what we see here is that they, in verse 7, are not rejecting Samuel, but they are rejecting God. They are rejecting God. In Genesis, God told Abraham and Jacob that kings would come from them. In Deuteronomy, God lays out instructions as to how a king should operate under Israel. To be just, to not be selfish and go after his own gain, not to have lots of horses, things like this. But unfortunately for the nation of Israelites is that these earthly kings were never the intended king. You see, they were supposed to be governed by God. God had set the Israelites apart. If we go back to Genesis, that was the whole point, that there would be a nation that was set apart to bring the light of the world to the world. Israel was supposed to be set apart, but too often in the Old Testament, what do we see? We see Israel not being set apart, chasing after false idols, giving bad sacrifices, doing all these things that they were never intended to do. And this here, requesting a king, was just another way that they were trying to not fit in, or trying to fit in. Trying to fit in. You see, Israel didn't fully understand, or maybe they lost the understanding, because they had it in Joshua. They had that understanding in the book of Joshua when they were fighting and taking over the land for themselves, for God. But between then and now, they had lost this sense of purpose, that their purpose was to be set apart. And I think some application for us that's good for us to remember and be reminded of is that we should be different as Christians. We should be different from the world. People should look to you and say, oh, why don't you do blank? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Not to make us look good, but because we are, as Christians, set apart. We are to be different than the world. It would be a problem if people looked at us and was like, oh, you're a Christian? I had no idea. That would be bad. We are to be set apart. You see, multiple times the nation says, we want a king so that we can be like other nations. And so the first area where the Israelites went wrong in this is that they wanted to be like other nations. They wanted to be just like the people around them. And the problem with that is that when you want to be like the people around you, you can't also be a light to the world. You can't have both. That's what we learned when we were looking at Solomon. When we were looking at Solomon, it was very clear, you can't do both. God either rules your life, and Jesus is your King of Kings, or you can be like everybody else. You can be set apart, or you can be like everybody else. And for some reason, the nation chose, hey, we want to be just like other people. And why was this wrong? As I mentioned before, it wasn't necessarily that they wanted a king that was the problem. Because as I said, God had set up rules for a king. He had said that they would come from Abraham and Jacob. But they already had a judge. Judges 11:27 says, therefore I have not sinned against you, but you wronged me by fighting against me. Then may the Lord, the judge, render judgment this day between the children of Israel and the people of Ammon. God was their judge. God was the one judging the nation. He was acting as judge. And so what we see is that the people of Israel were rejecting God as judge. They no longer wanted him to be in charge of that. They wanted a man. They wanted a king to be a judge. They wanted a king to rule after them. Why? Because that's what all the other nations had. Why is that problematic? Well, we have a couple of books in the Bible of problematic kings who are bad judges. Right? They thought that they didn't want Samuel's sons to be judges over them because they were wicked, but what they failed to realize is that it was a human issue. It was a human issue. Unfortunately, all human judges, kings, whatever you want to call it, will fail us. They will. In comparison to Jesus. And when it comes to your personal life, the way that you live your life, you cannot seek a human and have a human judge replace that which was always supposed to be Jesus. It was always supposed to be Jesus judging and ruling over our lives. And we have problems when we find ourselves desiring other people to judge on our behalf and to rule over our lives. When in reality, the person ruling over our lives, and what I mean by that, an application for us would be, who helps lead your family? Who gives you your thoughts and how you run your household, or how you do this, or how you do that, or how you operate at work, or how you do this, and what the things that you do, what guides you through life. If it's people, they're going to fail you, they're going to let you down, they're going to lead you astray. And it might be good. David was a great king. But what did David eventually do? Bathsheba. Right? And he sinned, and it caused it was a terrible, terrible moment. And it hurt the nation of Israel. After that, there was fighting, and then the nation split. If Jesus was their king, the nation would not have split. The nice thing is that there's hope. Because even though David sinned, this great, mighty king, he sinned and he did all this and he took his eyes off God, he was redeemed. Right? If you go back and you go to Matthew and you start looking at the genealogy of Jesus, you realize that Bathsheba was part of that genealogy. God took a really bad thing that caused the death of people, that tore the kingdom, and did all these really negative things. He took that and he brought forth Jesus from that. He redeemed that. And that's what God does. He redeems our mistakes. King Solomon came from David and Bathsheba. So meaning that the Proverbs we read, Ecclesiastes, all that wisdom was redeemed out of David's sin. And so yes, David failed in that moment. But God also redeems us. And so even if you find yourself not having Jesus as King of Kings in your life, God can redeem that. Not only can He redeem that, He desires to. The third area that the nation had gone astray and gone wrong was not only was God intending was supposed to be their judge, but He was also supposed to fight their battles for them. Joshua 10:42 says, all these kings in their land Joshua took at one time. Yes, go Joshua. But no, because the Lord God of Israel fought for them. If you go back and read the Old Testament, you see that in this specific time of history, in the Judges, how many times is it when Gideon goes down with his men and God says, no, I want you to dwindle it down. Okay, so He dwindles it down a little bit. Now he has less men, but still a good amount of men. And God goes, nope, do it again. So He dwindles them down again to a few hundred men. Specifically, why? So that the nation of Israel knew who had won the battle for them. See, the nation of Israel had it good. Not only was God supposed to be their judge, but God was the one who was going to fight the battles for them. They had God Almighty on their side. And all these stories we've seen in this history in the Old Testament of God fighting their battles on behalf of the nation of Israel. And I just think to myself how sad it is that we often forget the last battle that God won for us. So many times it feels like God brings us through this and we have victory in this, and then the next day it's like we don't even, and we want another earthly king. We want another earthly person to like, oh, I got to figure this out myself, or I got this new problem, and I got to, no. The nation had forgotten the greatness of Yahweh. Like God had pretty recently in their future brought them out of the land of Egypt. He had performed all those miracles. He had done all these great things. Manna had fallen from heaven. He led them by cloud and by fire. And then after that, what happened? They forgot. They forgot about all the battles that God had won for them. And they said, we would rather go back to Egypt. We would rather live in slavery than go fight the scary people in the promised land. And then those people kind of died. Well, not kind of. They did. They died off. They lost out on the blessing of the promised land because of their wickedness. And a new generation was risen up. And that generation, led by Joshua and Caleb, they went into the promised land. And God fought their battles all throughout the book of Joshua. And He gave them the promised land. And it's an amazing book about all these fights and these wars and God delivering them. And it's awesome. But even within that, there's some disobedience. And they don't fully do what they're supposed to do. They don't fully remove some of the inhabitants living in the land. And what happens? But those inhabitants slowly start to influence them. They start to see them and want to be like them and want to serve their gods and their idols. And they again forget the battles that God has just won for them. When we're looking at the Bible, we like to take, like, okay, well, how does this apply to us? Unfortunately, most of the time, we're Israel in the situation, right? Or we're Jonah. Like, we think like, yeah, I'd be like David. Yeah, maybe when he sinned with Bathsheba, not like David and Goliath. David, that's Jesus. Sorry. We are the Israelites. We're the ones cowering in the corner, so afraid and not wanting to take that step out. But even when David fought Goliath, and the Israelites were cowering behind him, and this young man steps up who knew that God would deliver the giant into his hand. David wasn't going out in that moment in his own strength. He was going out knowing full well that God was going to bring victory because God had done it before. And God had promised it to the Israelites. We have a God that wants to fight our battles for us. We have a God that when we're struggling with things at work or we're struggling with issues at home and it feels hopeless, or in our personal lives we're struggling with sin and it feels so hopeless, we have a God who's sitting there and is like, call out to me. Call out to me and I will fight for you. I will deliver you. And so we looked at Saul. Specifically, that's what I shared on. And Saul was the first king. He was the first one that they brought forward. And it's interesting because I think that in Saul's life, we see three key applications that helps us not be like the Israelites. So those three things where the Israelites failed and they wanted to be like other nations. They no longer wanted God as their judge, and they no longer wanted God to fight their battles for them. I believe in Saul's life, we see really three ways that we can get back to where God wants us to be. And he was an interesting king, right? He was a tall, handsome man. He was the most handsome and tallest man in Israel, is what the Bible literally says. And he didn't even want to be king. In the beginning, he's like, I'm just a Benjamite. Like, why would I be king? Like, I'm the least of these. Like, not me. But eventually, the people didn't even want him at first. But eventually, he wins. He's filled by the Spirit, and he wins his first battle against the Amorites. And what happens? He gains the support of the nation, and he actually, for the first time, establishes a national army. And not only that, but he brings the nation together. He brings the nation of Israel together, and it's like, oh, this guy, maybe the Israelites are right. And for a little bit, it was good with Saul. Saul was like, Saul's the man. We love Saul. We're getting more land. We're beating these guys around us, pushing the Philistines back. We got an army. But then, unfortunately, Saul makes three mistakes in Saul's life that lead to his downfall. And for us, I think, can help us understand how we can return Jesus back to its rightful place. In 1 Samuel 13, verses 6 through 14, it says this: When the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, then the people hid in caves and thickets and rocks and holes and in pits. And some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So, what's happening? The Philistines are gathering around the nation. The Philistines are getting ready to attack, and Samuel tells Saul, do not attack. Wait 7 days so that I can come perform a sacrifice. We have to understand that it was the job of the prophet, the seer at that time, to perform that sacrifice. It was his job laid out in the law, right? In other words, it was God's will. God desired that the certain people from certain tribes had certain responsibilities. That's how he set it up. And he said, all right, when this happens, this is what I want this guy to do, blah, 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 all the way on. Everybody had a job. And so it was Samuel's responsibility to provide this sacrifice. But if we continue, verse 9, so Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offering here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came and Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. And Samuel said, what have you done? Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered from me and that you did not come within the days appointed and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore, I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established you as kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord commanded him to be commander over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Saul offers this unlawful sacrifice. He does something that he was never supposed to do. It was not his job. Saul was more afraid of the enemy. He had more fear of the enemy than he had fear of God in his heart. And by fear of God, I don't mean, I'm afraid of God that he's going to smite me or whatever. No, it's reverence, right? He cared more about what was happening in front of him and the army that he saw getting ready to attack, he was so afraid of them that he was willing to disobey the law of God. That he was willing to break that. Think about that. It's kind of backwards logic. Like, God's going to bless me for breaking the law. Right? No. But so many times we're so focused on the enemy or what's in front of us, the fear that's in front of us, right? Whatever it might be. We're so afraid of the problem we see at hand that we kind of freak out. And we are so unwilling to just sit and wait for the Lord. It's our fear that drives us to disobedience oftentimes. And when we're fearful, instead of spending more time praying, right? Like the first thing we should do when we're afraid of an outcome, or maybe you're not literally afraid of something, but you're dealing with a problem and it's causing some sort of fear in your life, the worst thing that you can do at that moment is act. You cannot act out of fear. The response should be prayer. It should be going to the Lord in prayer and saying, Lord, what do I do? What needs to happen? God had set a plan, and he had a way of things. In all his infinite wisdom, he had a way. And Saul, his mistake was he didn't trust in that. And he acted in his fear. In chapter 15, in verse 1 and 3, Samuel also said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God of Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them. Kill both the men, the women, the infant, the nursing child, the ox, and the sheep, camel, and donkey. So, God gives Saul a very specific job. Go and utterly destroy these people. Now, these were some really, really bad people. Like, really, really bad. And if you go and you can look, we can talk about it afterwards, but you can go and you can look at what this king did and what he was about, and you realize, like, man, that's some wicked above wicked stuff. And in this moment, God is using his ability as God to judge a nation. He's using Israel as the one to do it. He's judging evil. He's judging wickedness, and he's using the nation to do it. So he receives these instructions. And unfortunately, in verse 7, it says, and Saul attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which was east of Egypt. He also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything displeased and worthless they utterly destroyed. So, Saul's given a job. Completely destroy them. And what does he do? Not that. For some reason, he thinks it would be a good idea to keep their king, who, he's just the worst. You go Google him, and you'll be like, yeah, that guy's the worst. And he destroys everything that was bad, right? That was easy. I can destroy the ugly sheep. That one's not very skinny. He doesn't have very much meat on his bones, but that one's nice. I'm going to keep that one for me. So he keeps the good stuff and destroys the bad stuff, right? When God gives us instructions, he expects us to fully follow them. And in our lives today, we don't see something like this. But what we see is when there's sin or there's evil around us and God's like, get it out of your house. Why are you consuming that? Right? And God's like, you should have things that enter your body, your mind. It should be uplifting. It should be good. Get rid of it. You're like, well, okay, I can get rid of this, but like I don't want to get rid of that because I kind of like some of those shows. Like they're kind of bad, but like, they're not too bad. Right? Like that kind of stuff affects us. And I'm not saying that God's going to say that for everybody, but this is just an example. If maybe you struggle and you listen to music that doesn't glorify God, and God's like, hey, I want to, and this is just something that He might bring up to you or put on your heart. Hey, I want you to remove that music from your life. Or those TV shows, or those apps on your phone, or like it could be literally anything. I want you to remove them. And you're like, okay, I can do that. I don't like that song anyway, and this one's not too good, but I really like that one, so I'm gonna keep that one. Are you fully obeying God? No. Saul again fails to obey God. And then the final thing in Samuel chapter 18, returning from a great battle, in verse 5, so David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Then Saul was very angry and the saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have only ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. And after this is obviously when Saul goes crazy on David, tries to kill him, throws swords, and all that stuff that happens. But it's kind of like the final straw that broke the camel's back in this moment. But I think it gives us a lot of insight to what truly happened to Saul and was happening to Saul. Saul started looking for validation from people and not from God. You see, as Christians, we serve God, not others. Like, we do acts of service for each other. This is an act of service for you, but I serve God, not you guys. Right? And so if God says, say it, it has to be done. People can't let the fear of what other people think affect their ability to serve and obey God. We have acts of service, and we are absolutely called to do things and to lay down our lives for others. And yes, I would absolutely do that for anybody in this church. Serve them however I need. At least try to. But at the end of the day, my validation does not come from you guys. It doesn't come from even my wife or my children. It comes from God. And it has to. Because if you seek validation from anyone other than God, you're going to be let down. When you are serving other people, if your reason is so that you look good for them, your reasoning is wrong. You need to pray and ask God to forgive you and make it Him the reason. You need to ask Him, hey, God, make it you that motivates me. Because how can you truly serve people when you're trying to please them? You can't. Because when you're trying to please people, you're unwilling to do hard things. You're unwilling to say hard truths. And how many times has somebody in your life that you love dearly, they've had something that you've heard and be like, hey, that's an issue. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't, blah, blah, blah. And because you love that person, you're willing to tell them. You're willing to not be the cool friend or the cool uncle or whatever it might be and be like, hey, you need to stop doing that. It's hurting you. And I don't want to see you hurt. I want to see you thriving. Our service has to come out of a place where we realize that we serve God and obey God first. And when we do that, then what's going to happen? We're absolutely going to serve other people. And we are going to absolutely help them and be a joy to them and all these things. But our validation must come from God and not from others. And it's in this moment that what Saul really did is he took his eyes off God. Right after this happens, it says that the Spirit left Saul. The Spirit left Saul. God had the Spirit of God was dwelling in Saul, and it left. Now, that's an Old Testament thing. We don't have that worry now as Christians. If we've been born again, we believe that we are sealed permanently. We don't have to worry about the Spirit leaving us and abandoning us, because just like David, as I said earlier, God can redeem messes. In fact, that's what God does best. He redeems those failures. But how many times has your life ever felt like, man, I just don't hear God? I just don't see God working in my life. Maybe my Bible reading feels like I'm talking to a wall, or my prayer life feels like no one's answering. And sometimes that could just simply be a season. It could just be a season where, God's like, hey, I want to see you kind of grind through it. And through this tough time, I want to see you keep working and keep being faithful. And God's trying to build your faithfulness and your capacity to do things even when you're not getting something out of it. But sometimes it's sin. Sometimes there's a sin in our lives that is kind of like a roadblock. And we need to take that moment to stop and pause. Say, okay, Lord, I'm something's not going on. And oftentimes, if we're being completely honest, we probably know what it is, right? Like we're not dumb. It's not that dumb, right? Like we know. When we have sin in our lives, we know. We pretend we're like, what? That's there? Oh, I didn't know. Right? No, we know. And sometimes what God's trying to do is he's trying to expose that sin so that you can get forgiveness and he can redeem that, and then we can move on. And we can move on with our lives. And I think what we learn from Saul is that the earthly kings fail. Where Saul was impatient, I'm reminded of Jesus, who took 30 years before he started his earthly ministry, knowing that very well that if he started now, he could absolutely help people. But he was patient and he obeyed. Why? So that the law, the prophecy that stated when he would start his ministry would be fulfilled. Where Saul failed to be obedient and say no to his flesh, and he took the best of the best but destroyed the bad, but he kept the good even though he was supposed to keep nothing. Jesus was completely obedient, even obedient to death on a cross. Where Saul took his eyes off God and put it on to other people, Jesus displayed perfect obedience. He never took his eyes off God. Every morning, what did he do? He woke up and he prayed. He read the law. He did these things. He always had his eyes on the Lord. You see, earlier I mentioned that the sin of the nation wasn't necessarily that they wanted a king. God was always going to give him a king, but it was always supposed to be Jesus. Jesus was supposed to be this perfect, not supposed to be, but he was supposed to be the only and perfect king for the Israelites. And oftentimes we can be like the Israelites, and we can trade King Jesus for an earthly version of him, whatever that might look like. We serve. That's what we do. We either serve God or we serve the world. Right? Life is tough. Life is hard. It's a marathon. And sometimes we might fall. We might mess up. We might sin. But we need to actively keep our eyes on God and God alone. We need to give up our desires, the fleshly desires of our heart, sometimes even sin, and we need to fully obey God. Saul's failures were in those three areas. If we are actively seeking those out, to do the opposite, to keep our eyes on God and God alone, always, to sacrifice our fleshly needs, and to obey God fully, then we're going to be on the right track. If that's how we're acting, then I believe it's pretty fair to say that in that moment, Jesus is your King of Kings. If that's our heart, and we're focused on God and all those things, then we're acting as Jesus is our King of Kings. And again, what I think that we all took away from this camp that was so beautiful, and as the worship team comes up here, and I close with this, that Jesus has to be the one and only. We were designed, we were built, we were made so that Jesus would completely and 100% rule our life. And why would we settle for anything less than that? Because if we look at the Old Testament and look at the Bible, we can see the fruit of Jesus being King of Kings in our life. We can see the fruit of God having complete control of our lives. All the victories and battles and all those things that were amazing. That's the fruit of Jesus having complete control over the Israelites' life. And then we can also see the fruit when they want a king. And it's the complete opposite. That feeling that we have, that emptiness that we sometimes feel, is because Jesus is not fully our King of Kings sometimes. There's things blocking it. There's sin in the way. There's maybe anger at God. Or maybe you haven't accepted Christ into your heart. And we would love to do that with you if you've never done that. But if we want to live a life that glorifies God, and not only that, but a life that is satisfying for us as humans, and a life that is full of blessings, Jesus has to be the King of our hearts.